Right, we're back for Marxism now. Now, Marxism is a little bit tougher, I think, than some of the others, and this is traditional Marxism that we're going to be starting off with. I'll do a quick supplementary one for, I might tag Neo-Marxism onto the end of this, so this might be a slightly longer one. So, with Marxism, structural, macro, official statistics are obviously rejected because of the bias in favour of the ruling class. And we're going to look at, obviously, some of the crimes that our Marxists think are going to be more likely to be happening in just a second. We would note that for Chambliss and other Marxists, capitalism is criminogenic. The reason that it causes and creates crime is fundamentally part of the system, because the system is exploitative and it creates poverty. Within the system as well, it passes on the capitalist ideology. And remember, the capitalist ideology, CCIG, competition, consumerism, individualism, greed. Those four values are embedded in the capitalist system. And it's criminogenic because it not only does it make people poor, but it makes people poor plus poor living in a capitalist world. And by virtue of the fact that capitalism itself is also exploitative, it should be classed as a criminal enterprise in its own right. So the fact that you are going to work for far less than the bourgeoisie should be itself criminal. Now, we can look at a lot of different areas of Marxism when we have Bonga and his idea of working class crime. Now, what Bonga is going to say is that obviously the reason that we see criminalities is really based on these two factors. The fact that people are poor and the fact that people have the social condition of capitalism. So it's not just that people are, down and out or destitute or in poverty. It's also that you're in poverty and in a capitalist world where you are seeing the promotion of goods and services, the consumerism element and the individualism element. Like, you should focus on yourself, you should be a consumer, and fundamentally that's going to make you greedy. You're going to compare yourself to other people in the working classes, and you're going to say, oh, I want that mobile phone, or I want that laptop, or I want those pair of trainers, and I can't get them because capitalism's not allowed me to. Therefore, that is why people go and become criminal from the working classes. It's like capitalism's forcing their hand, remember, because this is a structural theory. So in some sense, we're going to have to talk about the deterministic element of it today, which is going to be a big problem. But it's almost like, well, because you're working class, according to Bonga, this is the root. Now, we see, obviously, them study the ruling class crime and the situation with the bourgeois, and hence their lack of confidence in the official statistics. Now, we can see from writers like Chambliss in his classic Seattle study, in Gordon through the notion of selective law enforcement, and Neocleus in the idea that capitalism acts as a tool for the ruling class to dominate the working class, but actually the situation is not fair for the working classes. These studies will show that the police, the judges, the system are fundamentally flawed in favour of the ruling class, who can get away with crime, who can continue to exploit, who can continue to make as much money as they possibly can, through whatever means necessary, especially in Chambliss's study, against the working classes. So ruling class crime is definitely something that they think is going on, and the unfairness we can see through these writers. But, and this is the key one for our Marxists, what we've got is corporate crime also playing a huge and devastating role. We looked at Bhopal, and around the world there's been lots of other examples of corporate crime, where Snyder would suggest that actually the real problem here is not blue-collar crime that our official statistics show, but corporate crime that we don't see measured on here. 100,000 industrial-related deaths compared to 20,000 murders in America show that 5 times more dangerous to the general population is the corporate crime and the impact of corporate crime. So that's going to be the main one that is not explained. or not really counted in our official statistics, and is causing the problem. Now, there's lots and lots of criticism that you could throw at this. You know, Bonga and his ideas about working class crime. Not every working class person commits a crime. You know, Chambliss' study in Seattle is from the 1970s. Is this a very dated idea that the police are taking bribes and that there's this kind of corruption? Snyder and Pierce and corporate crime. Well, you know, is it the same? You know, do you think it's the same by suggesting that, you know, a corporation maybe cut corner or had an accident at work are the same as a person who's robbing a granny in the street? Like, there are lots of potential points of evaluation here, but we obviously have got a big problem here in that traditional Marxism is too deterministic. Now, when we get something that's too deterministic, and structural theories generally are too deterministic, this is why traditional Marxism kind of falls out of favour. And you've looked at how it fell out of favour in stratification because of a lot of the weaknesses of Marxism as a predictive theory, but we're not really concerned here with the fact that there was no revolution, or we're not really concerned here with the fact that you know, we didn't see the emergence of the middle class. Don't get me wrong, you can make that comment, you know, in an essay that Marx sees, you know, communism as a way of potentially ending crime, and maybe that's a naive view, because in all of those places where we've seen communism happen on a large scale, such as the Soviet Union, we've seen the level of murder go right through the roof, right, in terms of the gulags. So certainly that's something that you could make an argument for. And when you look at big capitalist countries like Switzerland, very, very low crime rate. So this traditional Marxist argument doesn't quite work on a number of ways, but in sociology it got far less popular because of the deterministic element. Because, you know, like Bonga's saying, because you're this, because you're that, you end up this. So when we've got a theory that's too deterministic, what we need to do is we need to make it less deterministic. So what we see is a combination of a social action theory and a structural theory together. So we see interactionism kind of fuse with traditional Marxism, and we end up with Neo-Marxism. Now remember, there are two strands of Neo-Marxism. There is subcultural theory, which we won't talk about for too long because it's the writers from the CCCS, and there is new criminology. Our new criminology is Walton, Taylor and Jock Young. And for our new criminology, remember, because we've kind of fused a deterministic theory with a social action theory, because we've pushed those two together, that macro and that micro, we're going to say and be able to talk about the fact that individuals are making a deliberate choice to resist capitalism. They're not robots going about their actions. They're making a choice like Robin Hood to deal with the unequal wealth distribution in society. If you are poor and you go to steal from Tesco, if you take 100 quid from Tesco or rob a grand out of the Tesco tills, you are Robin Hood because you're poor and you're redistributing the wealth from Tesco, who is rich. And this allows them to create a fully social theory of deviance, which will look at the reasons. Well, we'll look at the process of going from act all the way down to maybe deviancy amplification, which we see in interactionism. But in traditional interactionism, everything starts with an act. But here, if we're doing neo-Marxism, because we're putting a structural and a social action theory together, the structural theory can talk about what happens before the act, when the social action theory can show how the label affects from the act. And we can see that in Stuart Hall's classic Policing the Crisis, where he's going to say capitalism's to blame, the economic crisis is going on, we need to distract from capitalism, so we're going to target black mugging when that happens, we're going to make the black people the folk devils in this moral panic, and then we're going to target more black people with high amounts of stop and search, which will lead to deviancy amplifying itself with more arrests and riots such as Brixton. Or the formation of, you know, subcultures like Rasta or Rude Boy. Now, this is new criminology, right? You know, crime being seen as a deliberate response, fight back, and we can see, as I said, through Hall, but you've also got Stuart Gilroy as well, you know, who would say black crime is active resistance against racism, and also a myth. And there's a problem with those two things aligning themselves, which is a weakness of his point. But what you have actually got here is a useful kind of, a really, really useful way of exploring crime, and it takes into account now ethnicity, it takes into account choice and resistance. So nice lot of positives really for Neo-Marxism, which would have to go in your essay, and of course you've got the writers from the CCCS as well. So definitely in a Marxism essay should you be talking about the traditional Marxism, but you'll need a paragraph which talks about Neo-Marxism as well. And you can obviously, if it was me, I'd go new criminology and I'd just unpack this bit. And that's a usefulness, that's a good contribution to a theory when we see it develop like that, to kind of overcome the initial weaknesses of traditional Marxism. We've kind of got rid of those when we have Neo-Marxism. So that's kind of 2 in 1, Neo-Marxism and traditional Marxism for you.